the first Korean four-star general, and it's just a narrative, a memoir of his opinion or view of the war, like when he was fighting the war. And it says when he woke up that morning, he woke up and he received a call about what was happening, and looked outside and there was tanks in the streets, South Korean like trucks in the streets, and he had to hurry, get dressed, put on his uniform, and run to his office. And when he got to his office, the military base was chaos, obviously, because of the invasion, and he didn't even know he had just switched to a different division, and he didn't even know if he was still head of that division or somebody else was. And so that kind of summed the essence of that morning. And because of that attack, because it took South Korea so much time to react to the invasion, Seoul was actually lost. The capital city was actually lost 3 days later. So they couldn't even hold them out of Seoul, hold the North Koreans out of Seoul for more than 3 days. And they tried to build the bridge over the Han River, but that didn't stop the North Koreans. And so by September of 1950, the U.S. still hadn't stepped in yet, and North Korea had control of pretty much around 90% of the peninsula. And so South Korea at this time, a lot of the leaders were hoping that the Americans would step in, but it wasn't really official. In America, I read another book by an American author, in his view, or what he researched and found out about the war. And the Truman Party, Truman was the president at the time in the U.S., and it was a very sensitive topic, or a very debated topic, whether to enter into this war or not. Also, the North has had extremely superior firepower during the war until the U.S. stepped in, because they were supported so much by the Soviet Union. So yeah, like I said, the Truman administration President Truman was the president at the time. So the reason that a lot of the people didn't want to go to war was because they were afraid that the U.S. entering a war with two of the strongest powers in the world, the Soviet Union and maybe China, they didn't want to start what could possibly be a World War III. Also, they thought the Soviet invasions and stuff in Europe were bigger problems, and they also thought that the U.S. didn't really have much responsibility to Korea. Korea was kind of just thrown at them after the end of the war, and a lot of people didn't really think it was outside of their boundaries, and a lot of people didn't really think it was a big deal. And one of the biggest ones, especially towards the end, as President Truman had to make his decision, a lot of the people in President Truman's cabinet thought that it was a trap to lure the U.S. into war with the Soviet Union. And so they kind of thought the Soviet Union to push North Korea to go into the South Korean, or to invade South Korea. But some of the positives of going to war were to keep communism from spreading, and to have a pretty good democracy in Asia, and then also to protect Japan, because the U.S. could kind of tell that Japan was doing well and they were growing, and they were going to be a big part in Asia. And so if the Soviet Union had taken all the way up to Korea, all the way up to South Korea, that kind of doesn't leave any buffer zone. And the Soviet Union could easily take over Japan later. And that's coming from the standpoint that this was all the Soviets' plan. But as we all know, the U.S. did step in. Douglas MacArthur was the head general over the military, and so he was in Korea a lot. He was in Japan, kind of governing the war. He actually had a lot of there was a lot of controversy with him and President Truman, because he didn't really like listening to the president. He just wanted the president to give him control of the war and let him make all the decisions. but actually when the U.S. when they would enter the war, that was the first time like the U.S. military had stepped foot on mainland Asia, which I thought was kind of shocking. So it was kind of, well, that was another reason a lot of people didn't want to go in the war. They didn't want to make that presence onto mainland Asia. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, like this was, I don't know if you know Korea, like people who've been to Korea, this is pretty much like the Busan mission, like this area. And by the time the U.S. stepped in, North Korea had everything except like right around Daegu. And so there's the Daegu like Nakdong line that the South Koreans did actually a remarkable job at holding. And so once the U.S. did decide to step in, they were sending in troops from Japan that they had reserved in Japan. So one of the biggest, once the U.S. stepped in, the war turned pretty quickly. It was a really daring but smart move by MacArthur, and he sent a division to make an amphibious landing in Incheon, which is about 100 miles behind enemy lines, and that was on September 25th. And because they made that attack in the rear, and most of North Korea's troops were up at the front, it kind of flanked them, and the U.S. was able to take back the capital, or they took back the capital on 25th, which was only like a week or two after that invasion. And then actually by October 19th, they were all the way up to Pyongyang, taking Pyongyang. And by November in November of 1950, they had almost 90% or 80% of the entire peninsula. And at that time, it looked, almost everybody within the U.S. Army and South Korean Army thought that the war was over, and that it was just going to be a breeze just to take over the rest of the peninsula because the North Korean Army was pretty much laying down. And so this was when the U.S. stepped in September of 1950, and by November of 1950, they were all the way up to here. And so you can kind of see that drastic change of when the U.S. stepped in. One of the big reasons, like North Korea had a ton of Soviet tanks, and the South Korean Army had 0 tanks. And as you can imagine, it's hard for a person to take down a tank. And so once the U.S. stepped in with some of their tanks, then it was their superior tanks, then it moved the war pretty quickly. But little did the U.S. know, the Chinese army had been moving in troops for about a month. And the U.S. had a ton of air support, and so they were flying over North Korea and just kind of figuring out how their troop movements were going. But the Chinese would only move at night, and they would only stay inside the trees. And so from the air, it was impossible to see Chinese movement. And so the U.S. was just pretty much walking around, getting up to the North Korean border, just so they could take the whole country, and the war would be over. But as they were getting up closer, they started walking into valleys and stuff, and then all of a sudden Chinese troops just kind of started coming out of the valleys and out of the trees, and it was pretty much a massacre on U.S. and Korean troops, because they're completely unexpected. And so it actually took the U.S. took the army, the U.S. and South Korean army a day or two to figure out that it was actually Chinese military. And so that's how confused they were. And so it was actually, the picture's covering it, but this overlook was the largest, the fact that the U.S. didn't notice that the Chinese had entered the war, it's the largest overlook in U.S. military history, because it did cause so many more deaths. It caused the war to go on another 2 years, and just so many more deaths. The Chinese used lots of noise and intimidation in their warfare. They would go out by night. They would go out at night and just hit gongs right next to the wars, or right next to especially when China was like defeating the U.S. In China, was defeating the U.S. and China. Whenever the soldiers would hear that noise, they'd get really scared and be pretty ineffective. So just some general facts about the war. North Korea had about 150 to 200,000 troops on June 25th. They ended up with like around 260,000. And on June 25th, so the very start of the war, South Korea only had 98,000 troops. So that's a huge, huge difference. They ended up getting 600 total, but they had only had a 22-piece Air Force when North Korea had an entire Air Force division. And also the South Korean Army, especially when the U.S. stepped in, was often viewed as pretty valuable, and they were only used as often used as scout teams or backup or even bait sometimes, as many South Koreans viewed it. So the U.S. stepped in with almost 330,000 troops. 33 of those thousand were killed, 110,000 were injured, and then the rest of the UN only had about 40,000 troops, with Great Britain having about 14,000 troops. So the UN, it was mostly a U.S. war. The death toll for Allied troops that is Korea and U.S. and the UN was 970,000. And North Korean Chinese, it was a lot. It was a lot different, with 1,640,000 troops. And so like the North Korean Chinese had a ton more troops. It just wasn't even. But then the U.S.'s like superior firepower was what kind of helped the war. And the South, and so a lot of citizens, especially in the North, were killed. It was pretty sad. But the U.S. did a ton of air raids and bombings, and so that kind of led to a lot of civilian death. Okay, and since the war, it's been a bit different. Just to finish up about the war, it kind of, the U.S., so after that November surge, and then China stepped in, the war, they were pretty much, once China stepped in, they fell back all the way past Seoul, down to even back down to Daegu once, and they made another surge, and it ended up at the 38th parallel, and it was pretty much, they fought at the 38th parallel for right around a year, and so it was kind of a stalemate for quite a while. But since the war, there's been a few incidents, many involving the U.S. There was the axe murder incident, which my dad was actually on his mission at that time, and they were the missionaries had to check in every hour to the mission home to make sure that they weren't going to be slided out of there. And so that's how severe it was. It was really intense. It was the most intense the governments have been since the war. And I'll explain that. I have a picture on the next slide that shows that. And then there's also obviously the 2010 incidents that left a lot of tension. And it's the tension's kind of been growing since that torpedo incident, where North Korea took down the ship. And then there's the